Imagine you're a team leader in an industry where all your competitors are cutting corners and breaking the rules. How do you compete and yet remain distinctively Christian in your workplace? Or put yourself in the shoes of a woman in the shadow of grief has left her homeland to start life in this country. She's nothing to her name. She's reduced to relying on handouts and the basics bank and so on. How would you act as a follower of Jesus in that situation? Or think of an older woman, unable to work anymore, returning to the place of her birth to live out her final years. What does being a faithful Christian look like in that context? This short biblical book of Ruth that we've read a little bit of this morning is about those three characters. It's at a time in ancient Israel's history when we're repeatedly told that everyone did as they saw fit. In other words, if there were rules there, people thought the rules were there to be bent or broken. It was a society where few people paid any attention to God's instructions on how to live life. If there was a ladder to climb, it didn't matter if you trampled on other people on your way to the top. If there were people on the margins of society, it didn't matter if you ostracized them and sort of forgot that they existed. In some ways, it felt like a culture pretty similar to our own. And so as we continue this series about being a Christian in our everyday settings, I think this book provides us with some really helpful examples of what it means to live as a Christian in our everyday settings. The main point of the book is to show how God is faithful and keeps his promises and works his purposes and his plans out in the midst of everyday life, in the midst of a society where there's famine and injustice and so on. But one of the main points as we read through the book, we realize that actually it's not set in a temple, it's not set in a religious setting, but the way that God is working his purposes out is through ordinary everyday lives, through the workplace, through the home place. And that's so often true today as well, isn't it? The way God works his plans and purposes out, the place there God keeps his promises, isn't here in this building, it's out there where we spend all the other hours of our weeks. A few weeks ago, to kick off this series on work, Keith spoke about God's plan for our work, how work is part of our calling, how work is good for us, how in some ways we partner with God when we work. I was thinking of that when I visited the community hall, the building site a few weeks ago. And I was looking at, there were some roofers there, putting in the screws, and there were some scaffolders there, making sure it was all safe and so on. And I was thinking, well, how is that partnering with God in his work? And I thought it's so easy for them just to think, well, we're just doing scaffolding or we're just putting a roof on. Actually, no, look at the bigger picture of what's going on there. They are building a center which is going to be used as a place for community to be built. It's that they are contributing to people finding friendship, finding a place of belonging. That is what they're doing. They're not just hammering nails into wood. And so finding where our work fits into God's big picture, I think can be really helpful for us, particularly if we're in quite menial tasks and repetitive tasks. And Keith mentioned, Jesus, he was a carpenter for years and years, and he grew up in an ordinary home. I found that helpful thinking about, as I've been doing chores around the house, thinking, well, if Jesus had to do chores when he was on earth, then I should be able to put up with doing chores as well. It's just that shift in thinking, isn't it, which sometimes helps us to approach these things with a different mindset. And then last week, Simon talked about some of our struggles with work. Yes, work is good for us. It's part of God's good plan for us. But in a fallen world, work is often difficult and stressful for us. He talked about the Sunday scaries as we think about going back to work on a Monday, or in my case, the Saturday scaries, as I think about going to work here. But I know that there's people in our community who are facing unemployment at the moment. There's people who are so frustrated that they're not able to do more. They haven't been able to work for years because of so many hospital appointments or through ill health. There's people here on low pay who need to work more hours to earn more money, but they're already working all the hours God sends. Work is hard for many of us. And so what does it mean to be a godly witness in our workplaces? As I say, the key thing to note is that this book of Ruth isn't set in a religious setting. It's set in ordinary, everyday life. That's where God works out his plans and purposes for us. There's a chap called Mark Green he's a former advertising executive, but for years he's been helping Christians think about what it means to live as a Christian in their different frontline situations. And so here's 5 ways that he says we can be witnesses for Jesus, ambassadors for Jesus, without even having necessarily to talk about Jesus. You know, sometimes we think that we're not being a good witness unless we're having a conversation about Jesus, or maybe unless we're doing some social action project. He says, no, here's at least 5 ways that we can be good ambassadors without mentioning Jesus. And the first is simply to work well. To work well. Colossians 3:23 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. So whether we're cleaning up a patient who has soiled themselves, or we're speaking to a customer who's always grumpy, we're to think of that person as if they're Jesus. It's Jesus we're talking to. So in this book of Ruth, Ruth is out in the field. She's gleaning the bits the harvesters had missed. It's basically the ancient Israel's system of social security. That they were allowed to go along and to clean up some of the extras that the harvesters had missed, so to stop them starving. But people notice how well she is working. Verse 7, she came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. Later on, Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about 13 kilos. She's not a slacker, is she? 13 kilos. Amazing. Now, note that I said work well, not work harder. Sometimes we do have to work hard. The Apostle Paul says we worked night and day, laboring and toiling, so they wouldn't have to ask for money. But I know with rising living costs, more of us are feeling that we need to work harder or longer simply to make ends meet. Christians are called to work well, not necessarily harder. We shouldn't be the ones who are cutting corners. We shouldn't be slacking. Apparently in this country, most sick days are taken on a Monday or a Friday. A little bit suspicious that, isn't it? Christians shouldn't be the ones who are taking extra days off at the weekend just because they feel like it. Whether we're writing reports or preparing a lesson plan, we should work as if we're working for Jesus. Here's a second way that we can be good witnesses for Jesus. It's by ministering grace and love. Now, I could have chosen lots of different verses, but here's one from 1 Peter 3. Peter says, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Don't repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you are called. Isn't Akriti a wonderful example of that? You know, when she gets discriminated against or insulted at work, she's praying for them. That's returning evil with blessing. Marvelous. Now, you could argue that what Boaz was doing was simply following the Old Testament law and doing what he was supposed to do. It was a system God had set up to allow people to glean behind the harvesters. But remember, Boaz is living in a time when everyone did as they saw fit, so probably lots of his competitors weren't allowing that sort of thing to happen. But Boaz does allow it, and more than that, he goes above and beyond what the law asked him to do. So as one of the few people in his day and age who took his faith seriously, he knew that God's heart is full of compassion for the marginalized. And so he wanted to show some of God's passion in practical action to the marginalized people that he came across. For example, he says at one point in chapter 2 to Ruth, whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. A little bit later, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. Or after the meal, he tells his workers, pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up. So do you see how he's going above and beyond what the law asks him to do? He is demonstrating grace and love. What would it look like for you to minister grace and love where you are? Taking a moment to chat to a customer who looks sad. Getting some flowers for a friend who's been bereaved. Leaving a secret gift for a colleague who's been down recently. You know, when we do those sorts of things, we are demonstrating God's heart to the world. Here's a third way. We can mold the culture. Sometimes I've visited members of our congregation when you've been in your workplaces. So I've sat in the canteen at B&Q, I've sat in a consulting room at the GP surgery, not as a patient. I've been in the canteen at the General Hospital and looked around some of the units there and so on, and lots of other places as well. And it never ceases to amaze me how different some of those workplace cultures are. Some are great places to work, some are really challenging places to work. Boaz isn't afraid to be known as a follower of God in his workplace. And so as he goes out into the fields to see his team, how they're getting on, he calls out to them, "The Lord be with you." Now, that might sound a bit corny to us, but maybe it's the equivalent of us saying at the end of a conversation, "God bless you." You know, it's just dropping something in, isn't it, about our faith. And it's a little thing that Boaz does to set the culture in his workplace. It's showing that he's there to build people up, not to tear people down. You don't have to be a manager to influence culture. I heard a great story of a lady working in a lab where all the people were working very independently. You know, there was no team working, there was no supporting each other, nothing like that. And she thought, well, what can I do here to mold the culture? So once a week, she started bringing in cakes and getting them out at sort of morning coffee time. And this drew people together. They started talking to each other. They started supporting each other. They started looking out for each other. The morale went up. The productivity went up. And then a few years later, that lady left, and no one took on the role of bringing in cakes. And morale dropped and so on. And the managers sort of got in some consultants and some sort of team building experts and so on to try to restore this team. All they needed to do was get some cakes. What can you do to mold the culture where you are week by week? When I go into the school staff room, I'm always really impressed by how well the staff there talk about the really difficult children. Full of understanding, full of compassion. But maybe your workplace isn't like that. Maybe there's trash talk. What could you do to help lift that, to speak positively about other people? I've tried to do it on an individual basis. There is one member of staff who, you know, when they're not talking about work at all, they're talking about their home life and situations with the council and other things, always talks really negatively. And so sometimes after I've listened to them for a little bit, I just say, well, tell me something positive that's happened recently. And I'm just trying to change her mindset a little bit so she can see good that's coming. Mold the culture. Here's a fourth way. We can speak up for truth and justice. And the biblical prophets are full of statements like this. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Now again, why are we to do these things? Well, it's because these things are what is God's heart. So in Deuteronomy it says, the Lord defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. So as we speak for truth and justice, we are demonstrating God's heart to the world. You know, he's had such compassion on us. We want that to overflow through us to other people. So when we speak for truth and justice, we're showing God's heart to the world, showing people what God is like. Look what Boaz does. He knows that this lady Ruth is very vulnerable. And he knows there's a danger that when he's not there to keep an eye on things, his workers might take advantage of her. And so he says in verse 9, I've told the men not to lay a hand on you. Later on, he tells them not to reprimand her or rebuke her. Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, knows how vulnerable she is too. At the end of the chapter, she says, stay working in these fields, because in someone else's field you might be harmed. So do you see how Boaz is speaking up for truth and justice in his workplace? What would that look like where you are? When you see bullying going on, or a lowly worker being sexually harassed, when you hear racist comments, or suspect that people are being overlooked for promotion because they identify as trans. What would it look like for you to speak up for truth and justice in those workplaces? Here's the final way that we can be good witnesses. We can model godly character. Many of you know this famous verse from Galatians 5. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. When we model these things, again, we are demonstrating some of God's character to the world. Some of you know that in the next chapter in this book, Ruth takes a very risky course of action. In the middle of the night, she goes and lays down next to Boaz on the threshing floor. And it's a little bit complicated to explain why she does that. But basically, she's discovered that Boaz is a relative of Naomi. And that means that Boaz, in some ways, has a responsibility to look after that family by marriage. And so by going and lying next to her, it's a bit like a marriage proposal. It's saying, look, will you marry me? Will you look after me? And, you know, Boaz could have taken advantage of her very easily, middle of the night. But he doesn't. He shows great self-control. He models godly character. And when we apologize for mistakes without blaming other people, or even when we accept responsibility for something which has actually been someone else's fault, you know, that stands out from the crowd, doesn't it? We help people to see what our great God is like. When we demonstrate peace when everyone else is anxious, when we're patient with colleagues who everyone else just rolls their eyes at and tries to stay away from, when we have self-control on the Friday after work drinks to stop at just one or two rather than having a few too many, when we do those things, people notice. That's what it means to model godly character. And so 5 ways in which, even without talking about Jesus, we can be really good and effective witnesses in the workplace or wherever we find ourselves during the week. And as I say, people will notice. Some of you will know the podcast called The Diary of a CEO. And recently, he interviewed a chap called John Lennox, who's a Christian in his 70s or 80s, a great apologist, someone who sort of explains the Christian faith to other people. And he'd been grilling him a little bit about the Christian faith. And then he said, you know what? The thing which really, you know, the best advert for Christians isn't all your arguments about why atheism isn't right and so on. The best argument for Christians is Christians. It's people like you. He says, as I've interviewed different Christians over the years, I can tell there's something different about you. You see, people notice when we live differently. 1 Peter 3 says, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. Do this with gentleness and respect. So when we live these godly ways, we will stand out and we will have opportunities to speak about Jesus because people will ask us. Isn't again that what happened for Akriti? As people could see how different she was, they say, well, you know, tell me about this Jesus. Will you pray for me? Let's take these opportunities when they come. We can explain that actually, you know, we're not just being good by our own strength. It's God's Spirit who helps us to live differently. We can tell people about the God who loves everyone and wants everyone to love them and to know and receive and feel that love. You know, as Christians, we're so overwhelmed by God's love. We want to share it with others, don't we? We want to reach further with the love of Jesus. We're so grateful that God has shown us his mercy and forgiveness and so on. We want others to experience that as well. Let's be prepared to give others an answer for the reason for the hope that we have. At one point in the book, Boaz says to Ruth, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." I think that's a beautiful image of how God treats us. We've come to take refuge under the shadow of his wings. It's such a wonderful place to be. And that's why we want others to share that experience with us. The way God uses us to draw others under his sheltering, protecting wings is in our everyday situations. Let's be faithful witnesses where God takes us this week. If the band want to come back on up, and we will just have a couple of minutes of quiet, just to think through these 5 things. And maybe there's one in particular that stands out for you as relevant to you. So just pray quietly to God about this. Identify one thing. Is there one particular thing? And pray about it for this week. Lord, thank you for your Spirit. Thank you that we don't have to live the Christian life in our own strength, but you transform us from within. Would you go on transforming us, helping us to live in these ways in the places where you send us this week, so that we would be faithful witnesses for you.